what does it mean when somebody says the US dollar is the world reserve currency?
What it means is that about 80% of foreign exchange transactions around the world have the dollar on one side or the other. It means that more than half of all reserve assets held by global central banks are in dollars. And it also goes to the key point, which is that the dollar is by far and away the largest financial system in the world. So it accommodates trade, it accommodates investments, and it's also just in general a benchmark for value. It's still not just a means of exchange, but a store of value and a unit of account. The dollar is the de facto unit of account in many countries around the world. I'm married to a lady from Uruguay, and her entire family is indexed in dollars. Salaries, real estate, the whole shebang. So the world is de facto on a dollar monopoly basis, and it has been since the Great Depression and the New Deal. The thing that Franklin Roosevelt did was kill gold and force everybody to use paper money to the exclusion of all else.
How does that impact things when you have a dollar that goes from, say, 106 to 99?
Well, it's reflecting short-term turbulence caused by President Trump's trade policy and the market volatility we've seen. But let's be fair, the U.S. financial markets have still been recovering from the period during COVID and the extraordinary action that the Federal Reserve took. The Fed put so much liquidity into the system, and Congress as well. They spent money they didn't need to, so that the Fed had to start issuing its own T-bills. You remember that, Tom?
Right.
Reverse repurchase agreements. Well, that indicates that they've gone too far. I always tell my readers, if you want to know if the Fed's doing a good job or not, see if they have to issue reverses, because that's basically saying, it's like Mickey Mouse in the film, Fantasia, The Wizard's Apprentice. He has to mop up the excess water, and that's what Jerome Powell was doing. So the dollar, got very overvalued in my view for the wrong reasons. It doesn't reflect our economic fundamentals in terms of the deficit and things that other countries have to worry about. It reflects the fact that people use the dollar as the means of exchange. It also reflects the fact that we attract investment because we're still the most attractive market in the world for a lot of reasons.
How do you think that's happened over the last several years? How long has it been happening? And what's the impact on the U.S. and the world?
Well, it's been going on since time immemorial. Politicians don't like raising taxes. I don't care what country you're in. And going back to the inception of the United States, when we had no money, when we were using gold and foreign currency as money in this country, right up until after the Civil War, politicians would gladly issue debt rather than have to go ask people to pay taxes. Even during the Revolution, when you would think Americans were pulled together and we were fighting the British, no. They had to fund that whole enterprise with debt. And then the key thing was Lincoln. Lincoln fought the Civil War with greenback currency. It wasn't even money. In the days of old, it was considered debt. It had to bear interest. But after World War II, all of a sudden we're on steroids, because not only did the world go off the gold standard, but it said, okay, we're going to use dollars. And we're going to have this thing called the IMF and this thing called the World Bank that's going to help countries manage their balance of payments in a fiat system. Now, we all remember Nixon in 71 closed the gold window. That was kind of the end. But it was really Roosevelt that put us on the fiat system and took gold away. Think about this. All the gold in Fort Knox was confiscated from Americans in 1933. It was stolen from the banks that were members of the Federal Reserve System. All the shareholders of every U.S. bank at that time basically had their gold taken away from them by Franklin Roosevelt. So, we've come full circle. When you see the price of the dollar going down and gold going up, that tells you what you need to know.
On one hand, Trump's raised taxes, tariffs are a tax, right? So there's a raising of tax. And on the other hand, he's reducing income tax, certainly on certain groups of people, such as, waiters and
sure.
Hospitality
but they
workers.
Can't get their act together. I don't think they'll have a reconciliation bill this year. I think the conservatives in the House are going to dig their heels in on the one hand And then the Republicans in the Senate, they are not in any way, shape, or form ready to follow their colleagues in the House. So I wrote something about that for my clients this morning. You know, it's good to talk about, but I think what's going to happen is they're going to extend the Trump tax cuts, and that's it.
Got it. So do you think that Trump's wanting to reduce the deficit? I mean, he hasn't seemed to. He didn't in the first term. It doesn't really seem to be important. And do you think it is important to reduce the deficit?
Oh, I do. And I do think that President Trump has that as one of his objectives, but he's a politician and he's trying to hold his majority in Congress together, which means they have to bring some goodies back to the voter. It's just simple American politics. We are living in a world where we want it, but we don't want to pay for it. So, for example, we want to be able to put grandma and grandpa into nursing homes and assisted living centers that are subsidized by the taxpayer. But we don't want to pay for the taxes to cover the cost. That's what it comes down to. Do people want grandma to come home and live with them down in the basement? No. So, American society is still way out of balance in terms of what we receive and what we put in terms of taxes. And we make up the difference with borrowed money. It's as simple as that.
So what's the end result? I mean, does that go on forever?
I think it will go on for as long as the world allows it. But remember, they don't have many alternatives. Where else are they going to go? So that's the first problem for global investors. Everybody, when Trump first got started 6-8 weeks ago, everybody said, "Oh well, we're going to invest somewhere else. We're going to open accounts in London. We're going to do this and that." No, there's not enough assets out there to even begin to absorb the flight out of the United States. And then when you talk about gold, there's not enough gold above ground that's actually deliverable in a large transaction to even start that conversation, right? So ultimately, we're locked into dollars for the time being. Will the world decide to wean itself off? Yes. I've suggested something interesting that I think you would like. I think we should allow investors to go out there and buy all that low coupon debt that was issued during COVID, bonds that nobody wants to own because there's no carry, and use that for tax payments. Okay, so you pay your taxes at par, but you go out and buy that 20-year bond that nobody wants that has an 1/8% coupon. It trades at like 70
I'll tell you, my wealthy clients would love that. That's basically
it's a good idea. We could reduce the debt.
It's an absolute discount. It's an absolute discount on your taxes.
Yep. So. And the Treasury's getting par value, remember. They would have to pay interest on that piece of paper. So it's a big savings for them. But yes, to answer your question, Trump wants to reduce the deficit. He's hoping to grow our way out of it. I think that's very limited. We are in a largely mixed socialist/capitalist system, and the socialist piece is dead weight. Yep. The Democrats don't care. So you can't have a conversation with them about growth. I just joined the New York Mortgage Bankers Association to help some of my colleagues in the state. The politicians in New York are almost as bad as they are in Illinois. They don't care. All they want is power. So when you talk to them about growth and capital and bringing assets back in here to build new housing, for example, they don't care. It's almost impossible to have a conversation with them. So the conservatives have to carry the water. And that's why you're seeing this division in the country. That's why you're seeing companies relocate to places like Florida and Texas. They don't want to be in blue states. And that's unfortunate. It really is.
It's interesting. So one of the things you haven't mentioned as a potential reserve currency is cryptocurrency, like a Bitcoin. That would, obviously that's one that's not controlled by a government. And is that an alternative to the dollar where, say, the euro or the yen might not be?
No, I honestly don't think so. I think cryptocurrencies are, kind of a repetition. I just wrote a piece for my friends at Agora about the fact that the dollar, the fiat dollar created by Abraham Lincoln, was the first cryptocurrency. If you could have talked to people in that day and age, they would have just said, "Nah, I don't want that." And the classic example of this, I compare the cryptocurrency advocates to the Silverites of the end of the 1800s. At one point, they forced the Treasury to buy silver with paper. And you know what people did? They sold the paper immediately and bought gold. The U.S. government almost collapsed because of this silliness. And, crypto is basically a way of people trying to escape politicized systems because certainly every major currency in the world is a function of government. It is the government's monopoly, their control of the payment system, all of those things that ultimately make it functional. In the case of the U.S., the positives of our society, the openness, the opportunities add to that, right? And to me, the thing about coins, I'm a banker, right? I can't have anything to do with cryptocurrencies in the current regulatory environment, unless, I want to trade ETFs or something like that that's onshore, but not offshore, because as soon as I do a transaction with somebody offshore, I have a FinCEN problem.
Right.
So I think, to me, cryptocurrencies are an interesting phenomenon, but they're nothing new. Unfortunately, governments have a monopoly on money. And I don't think we can go back to the free banking period. I wish we could, but I just don't think as a practical matter it's going to happen. Because as soon as crypto got big enough to be, like you said, to be an alternative to the dollar, U.S. government's going to shut it down.
Yeah.
And, by the way, that's why the Chinese immediately prohibited it.
Right.
As soon as they saw it, they said, it's a threat to them. It's a competitive system. And so they immediately shut it down.